I raised my head and found myself lying on top of a pile of rubble. I wasn't too much worse for the wear, though, all things considered. I looked all around me frantically, but saw nothing even remotely familiar. This was definitely someplace new. And it didn't feel much like a school anymore. The walls and floor were made from packed dirt, with only railroad ties keeping it all together. I knew I was underground. I had to be. It just felt that way. There were no windows anywhere, and based on the smell, there was no ventilation either. Big Brother might have gotten caught off guard by that earthquake too, I thought. He could be down here. It was a big one after all. Maybe he was injured. Maybe he couldn't move. I tried pushing myself up from the pile of rubble, ready to shoot to my feet and continue the search. That didn't last long, however. My hands and feet were still a little numb from the ropes, making it hard to keep my balance. I fell back onto my bed. My underwear was completely waterlogged, like a full sponge. It squished unpleasantly on the debris, sending a cold chill through my entire body. I reached down and felt it, and it was absolutely soaked through it. It would take forever for it to dry. I was so wrapped up in running for my life and chasing after Big Brother, I didn't even notice the wetness, but now I couldn't get it out of my mind. Tears were welling up in my eyes. How could I be so pathetic? I forced myself to my feet, doing my best to try ignoring the squishy sensation. I wouldn't be able to ignore it for long, though. My panties were noticeably heavier now, and the urine they absorbed was practically ice cold. I couldn't go on like this. I was going to get a rash or catch pneumonia or something, and every step was going to be its own form of mushy, gushy hell. But what could I do? I could take them off, but then what? Carry them with me? Ew. Leave them on the floor for someone else to find? No, thanks. I swallowed my pride, held back my tears as best as I could, and waddled onward. And throughout the halls there are skeletons to get ID tags, and there was one in the science room too that we could have gotten, but I already got those. And there's 2 in here. There are thoroughly decomposed remains on the table here. Based on general appearance and what's left of the deceased's clothing, they appear to belong to a very young girl. There's one right there too. It's a set of skeletal remains. There doesn't seem to be any way to determine gender from clothing or build alone. Supposed to be something you trigger in here. Oh, it's if you look at the cabinet. Okay. Well, I'm gonna save, because that leads to a wrong ending. Okay, and let's go move on with the story. Want to wrap this up as fast as I can. The only bathrooms I'd seen up to this point were unusable. Charms on the door mysteriously sealing the room shut, bodies hanging in the stalls. But this looked to be a completely normal bathroom. Certainly the most normal I'd seen since getting stuck in this place, anyway. There's a loose piece of wood on the ground here. I tried pulling on one of the wooden stall doors. I listened carefully for any hint of a response, even going so far as to hold my breath. But there wasn't a single sound to be heard. The entire room was dead silent. The walls were made from packed dirt after all, and there was a lot of moisture in the air. Effectively, this whole place was naturally soundproof. I backed away from the stall slightly and almost tripped over a fairly sizable crack in the ground, about 5 centimeters wide and 1 centimeter thick. Finally, I was able to get out of those waterlogged panties. Despite being alone, I still crouched down and removed them as discreetly as I could. I then stuffed them tightly into the crack I discovered. Yuka のこんな姿、お兄ちゃんに見られなくてよかった。どうか誰にも見つかりませんように。特にお兄ちゃんには。Not that Big Brother would be likely to wander into a girl's bathroom, but it was possible given the circumstances. So just to be safe, I figured it couldn't hurt to pray that that didn't happen. でも、もうちょっと奥に詰めておこうかな。誰かに見つかったら恥ずかしいもんね。よし。My underwear was now totally buried and out of sight. There was no way anyone could come across it if they didn't know it was there. Satisfied, I stood up. I peeked my head out from the bathroom and looked around. My voice echoed a lot louder than I was expecting. It actually surprised me. Considering the wet dirt walls, I didn't think sound would travel that far. I began walking through the hall once again, this time a bit slower and more unevenly due to exhaustion. The door to this particular room was shuddering ever so slightly, as if there were a breeze blowing against it gently from inside. Slowly and hesitantly, I put both hands on the doorknob and started to turn. As soon as the door opened even a crack, a powerful, horrible stench slammed into my face and twisted around my nasal cavities like a jet of water. I was instantly feeling nauseous and lightheaded, as if I were suddenly deprived of oxygen. Holding my nose, I stepped back into the room and crept over toward the source of the noise. If there were water here, maybe I could wash my hands, I thought. My extreme thirst came back full force as well. Clean water was the greatest thing I could possibly find right now. I accidentally kicked over a bucket, spilling its contents onto the ground in front of me. Countless flies immediately flew out from the overturned bucket and began swarming all around me. Their buzzing wings sounded right up against my ears, as if they were attacking me. I let go of my nose and began flailing my arms wildly, attempting in vain to drive them away. As I haphazardly stumbled forward, I found my foot splashing in shallow liquid. Mere moments later, my hand came in contact with a wall and brushed against a switch. I heard a faint clicking sound, and then the lights blinked on, and I got a clear look at the room I was standing in. A large portion of the floor had been dug out into something resembling a pool, which was filled with stagnant, discolored water and dismembered bodies. The bodies were decomposing a lot faster than they naturally would, on account of the wetness. Most of them had swarms of maggots instead of faces. Several bodies had actually washed up on the ground outside the pool as well. Those few that still had limbs looked like they may lose them at any moment. The torsos were all swollen and black, and everything else was bone white. The closest body was spurting a sappy mucus from its nose and mouth and staring at me with an ugly, mean expression. The thick fluid coming out of it was reddish-brown in color and seemed to be a disgusting mixture of blood and dead bugs. Some sort of huge door high along the top of the wall opened up, and I could clearly feel a breeze blowing through the room. It was a trash chute? I was afraid of what might be coming through that hole, so I put some distance between it and myself. Something heavy fell from above and splashed into the pool, spraying my face with rotten, stagnant water. The body that had just fallen into the pool of water was wearing a school uniform. As soon as it touched the liquid, it began bubbling and melting into it as if it were a bag of ingredients tossed into a stew. One of the poor victim's lungs floated to the surface, giving the whole scene even more of a sick soup-like appearance. I dragged my wet foot on a dry part of the ground for a second or two, then made a dash for the door. As soon as I was back out in the hall, I fell to my knees in shock. I couldn't even move. The smell of death and decay was still sticking to me, and still trying to snake its way into my nose. It was all I could do not to throw up on the spot. I hadn't eaten anything for hours, so I'm not even sure what I would have actually thrown up, but I still felt like I had to, more strongly than ever before. Maybe it would have been best just to let it come out. I'm sure I would have felt better afterward. But I honestly didn't want to see my own vomit right now, not after all the other disgusting things I'd seen. I'd had enough. At times like this especially, I really longed for my big brother. If only he were here with me. I cried out for him as if in prayer. There was a little girl here with arm outstretched, begging for help. I rushed over to her side. She was faintly glowing. All I could do for her was offer physical comfort. If I rubbed her back, maybe she'd feel better. The girl grimaced again, as if she were experiencing some new pain all of a sudden. I gently brushed my hand against the little girl's face, wiping away her tears. I'd only just met her, but I already really felt for her. She had it a lot worse than I did. I took Sachiko's tiny little hand in my own and pulled her to her feet. Sachiko's hand was so thin and light compared to my own. Not just light, it almost felt like it was completely weightless. Sachiko noticed me staring at her, and I must have had quite a look on my face. This seemed to bother her, so I did my best to force a smile. I'm sure she was worried I'd leave her all by herself again, and I wanted to make sure she knew I was here for her. Sachiko lowered her head and looked like she was about to cry. I took Sachiko's hand in both of mine, turning to face her and ducking down a little so our eyes were level. I did have to think for a moment, since I knew I couldn't take a ghost with me very far, but in the end I also knew I couldn't just leave her. Her head was still down, but her eyes were peeking up at me. She looked nervous, but for the first time since we started talking, she also looked hopeful. Honestly, I was lonely too. I probably wanted her with me just as badly as she wanted someone with her. Ghost or no. I turned to head back down the hall, but was stopped by Sachiko tugging on my uniform. She was wearing a forced smile on her face, but still looked uneasy. What was she going to tell me to do? I was so surprised by the question, I wasn't sure how best to respond, but the longer I thought about it, the more uneasy she looked, so... There was clearly something specific she had in mind, but I wasn't going to push her about it. She had asked me when she was ready. She seemed satisfied with my answer and let go of my uniform. And so, hand in hand, we continued down the hall in search of my big brother. That's all she said, and then silently she squatted on the ground and wrapped her arms around her knees. She nodded firmly, almost exaggeratedly. As if to show me just how cold she was, she then started visibly shivering.
ねえ幸子ちゃん、何かゆかにできることない？何か。そう、幸子ちゃんがこれ以上辛くならないように何でも言って。じゃあお姉ちゃんのそれちょうだい。
She was pointing at my feet.
靴下？
This was the first time I noticed that Sachiko was walking around barefoot. I was so busy worrying about myself and about finding my big brother that I'd completely failed to pay any attention to poor Sachiko's appearance.
ごめんね、すぐ気がつかなくて。いいの。
Sachiko shook her head.
私お姉ちゃんなのにもっと早く気づいてあげられればよかった。
If I were big brother, I would have noticed right away and given her my shoes. But it wasn't too late. I took off my shoes and socks and offered them to Sachiko. They were a little wet, but still better than walking on these cold dirt floors in bare feet. I didn't really like the idea of doing that myself, but just one look at this poor lost soul's shaking form convinced me I was doing the right thing.
ありがとうお姉ちゃん。
Sachiko took just the socks, leaving the shoes in my hand.
幸子ちゃん、靴下だけでいいの？上履きは？うん。だってお姉ちゃんが裸足になっちゃうでしょ。
She flashed a gentle smile at me, which stayed on her face the whole time she slowly put on both of my socks.
ゆかお姉ちゃんに怪我してほしくないから。そっか、優しいんだね、幸子ちゃんは。
I patted her head, just like Big Brother always did to me.
お姉ちゃん大好き。
Her smile had grown. It now stretched from cheek to cheek, and I began to feel like I'd do anything at all to keep her happy. I wondered if this was how Big Brother felt when I smiled at him like that.
頑張ろうね、幸子ちゃん。
Despite the severity of the situation, I was in high spirits. I almost forgot just how horrible this place really was.
頑張る。うん、お兄ちゃんを見つけられるように。幸子ちゃん、今何か言った？
I thought that was a giggle. I thought that was a giggle, but it sounded different somehow. Like her voice had changed to someone else's. Or someone else was here. A gurgle or something like that.
うん。かわいい。むちゃくちゃしたい。何？何も言ってないよ。そっか。気のせいかな。
What is it they usually say in movies? Must have been the wind? Not too likely in a stagnant underground bunker like this, but still.
きっと怖がりすぎなのかも。もっとしっかりしなくちゃ。お姉ちゃんなんだから。
I put on the bravest face I could manage and marched back out into the hall, pausing only to make sure Sachiko was still behind me. The soles of Sachiko's feet seemed to be bothering her quite a bit. As we stood there, I noticed she was fidgeting in place, trying not to stand on them.
そうだよね。幸子ちゃん、靴下だけだもんね。
She said nothing else. She just stared at my feet. She seemed to want my shoes now, but didn't want to say anything since I offered them earlier and she turned them down. So I just smiled and decided I'd offer them again.
私の上履き履く？いいの？うん。幸子ちゃんまた怪我しちゃうもんね。お姉ちゃんは？ゆかはお姉ちゃんだから大丈夫だよ。
I wouldn't accept any objections. I just took off my shoes and handed them to Sachiko without another word. Cheerfully, she slipped them on over my socks. They were a little big on her, but I knew she'd feel better just having them.
ありがとう。嬉しい。じゃあ行こっか。
Sachiko wasn't used to such big, floppy shoes. She took one step and stumbled forward.
大丈夫？手つないでてあげるよ。うん。ゆかお姉ちゃん大好き。幸子ちゃん、ここは何もなかったから引き返そう。そう。このまま進んでていいのかな。こっちがいい。
Sachiko was pointing down the hall toward the spot where the earthquake had dropped me.
こっち？こっちに何かあるの？わかんない。けどこっち。何の音だろう。あそこに入りたい。あそこ？でもあそこは鍵が。今開いた音がしたの。何かあるの？お願い。入りたいの。そっか。じゃあそっちに行こうか。
Sachiko nodded firmly, then practically dragged me by the hand over to the door near my entry point in this underground maze. Energetic as can be, Sachiko pulled me farther into the darkened room. I suddenly felt a sharp pain in the sole of my foot, and I looked down to see what I'd stepped in. Oh no, tetanus. The floor here was actually kind of a mess. It was bumpy and uneven, and there were all kinds of tiny, sharp-looking objects scattered everywhere. Not just old, rusty nails, but bits of glass, loose wooden boards with jagged edges and splinters all over them, and plenty else I couldn't even identify.
Sachikoちゃん？どうしたのお姉ちゃん？あれ？そっちにいたの？何だったんだろう今の声。
Okay, and that one also yields an ID tag, but we're just gonna move on. It's a stack of folded up Japanese-style futons. Sachiko had found an old, oversized instant camera lying around somewhere, and was holding it triumphantly in her hands. Smiling from ear to ear, Sachiko carefully examined every inch of that camera. She was an innocent little girl with a brand new toy. carefully tiptoeing across the litter-strewn floor, nursing my sore and bloodied foot the whole while. I snaked my way over to the futons. I didn't much like the idea of sleeping in the same room as a dead child, but I had to admit I was pretty exhausted too.
ちょっと湿っててカビ臭いけど、敷いたら横になれるよ。眠い。よし、じゃあ今敷くからね。
As soon as the futon was on the ground, as flat as it would go, Sachiko sprawled out on it. It wasn't long before her eyes started drooping. Her eyes drooling? Ugh. Just seeing this innocent little girl joyously stretching out to take a nap was enough to lift my spirits and renew my hope.
こちらこそだよ、幸子ちゃん。だって今ここにあなたがいてくれなかったら。
She really must have been tired. She was out like a light the second her head touched the bedding. I awoke to find myself being shaken. Sachiko was trying to get me up, and her expression had gone white as a sheet. She was on the verge of tears. Something seemed to have really spooked her. Did that huge man find us? Was she attacked?
どうしたの？落ち着いて話して。髪留めなくしちゃったの。髪留め？起きたらなかったの。なんだ、そんなことか。あ、ごめんね。もっと怖いことかと。どこに落としたの？すぐ探せばあるよ、きっと。
The two of us searched every last inch of the room, near the wounded foot, but we came up empty-handed.
幸子ちゃん、お姉ちゃんはどうすればいいかな。
The entire time we searched, Sachiko hadn't said a word. I was hoping invoking our sisterly bond might help cheer her up.
髪が目に入って痛い。その髪飾り、ちょうだい。
She raised her right hand slowly and pointed to my headband.
これは、ごめんね。これはあげられないの。
As soon as I refused, Sachiko let out a faint, otherworldly groan. In the next moment, her face distorted and changed. She no longer looked like an innocent little girl. She looked well and truly like a demon now.
幸子ちゃん？よこせ。よこせ。
The look in her eyes alone sent chills down my spine. These were the eyes of someone who meant me harm and was perfectly capable of inflicting it.
どうしよう。
Give her the headband? Okay, so to clarify, both of these choices lead to the same conclusion. But one choice has some extra scenes as well as an extra CG image. But so one just has a little longer outcome than the other, but they both go to the same spot in the story. So we're going to choose the one that gives us more. Sachiko was continuing to groan under her breath. Fearing what she might be capable of, I desperately tried to console her.
幸子ちゃん、聞いて、幸子ちゃん。これはお母さんに買ってもらったばかりの大事なものなの。だから。お母さん。
Somehow or another, that seemed to quell her anger. Her facial expression snapped back into that of the gentle, kind girl I'd been talking to all this time.
そうなの。だからあげられなくて。ごめんね。お母さんからの？
Yeah, Sachiko loves her mom. She was oddly receptive to this explanation, and even seemed fascinated by it. Maybe I'd caused her to remember something about her own mother. She was a little girl after all, so her mom was probably really dear to her in life.
お母さん。お母さん。
She looked like she was on the verge of tears again. I was beginning to feel bad that I'd even broached the subject.
ごめんね。いいの。
She still seemed a bit sad, but she nodded. Maybe she understood that I wouldn't give her my headband, and maybe she was okay with it. She wasn't even looking at me anymore. I must have really upset her.
あのね、幸子ちゃん。カチューシャはあげられないけど、他のものならいいよ。他のもの？私にできることなんて少ないけど。他のもの。じゃあ、ここ。でも、ここは。
Without a moment's hesitation, Sachiko just opened the door and walked right in. I didn't even have an opportunity to stop her. The first thing I noticed when I entered the room was Sachiko's form sprawled out on the ground at the foot of the body pool. She was twitching a bit and moaning again, but this time it sounded more like a moan of pain than of anger. I stepped over her and turned around so as to put the decaying bodies behind my back and out of my sight, then started shaking her. I felt like I absolutely needed to snap her out of whatever this was before something terrible happened. I could feel her tiny cold hands on my abdomen through the thin cloth of my skirt. She was pushing me backwards with tremendous force. I lost my balance almost instantly and toppled over. It somehow felt like my fall occurred in slow motion. The walls and ceiling of the room grew more and more distant, but it happened gradually. Then I felt the murky liquid on my back and heard the splash. I was in the pool of bodies. Because I'd fallen backwards, it took me far too long to regain my bearings. I was submerged in that horrible, tainted water, close to drowning. I finally broke through the surface, dodging the many dislodged eyeballs that were floating on it like peas in chicken soup. Each one wrapped in dull red, bulging veins. I didn't even want to think about what was in all the water I'd swallowed. Unfortunately, much of it was still on my tongue. My mouth was filled with tiny bits and pieces of other human beings. The taste was overpowering. I was gagging and belching so hard, it felt like I was going to regurgitate all my internal organs. I tried to scream, but could barely get any sound past the foul, lumpy stew in my mouth. I was losing consciousness fast, and I remember silently praying, silently hoping that this was all just a dream. As the world faded around me, I just kept focusing on that one last wish. Please, let me wake up in my bed. I had no other choice. I grabbed Sachiko's outstretched arm and marveled again at her strength as she effortlessly pulled me out of the water. My entire body from head to toe was covered in sticky, goopy chunks of unidentifiable human flesh from countless different people. Slowly, hesitantly, I raised my hand to my head to feel around and determine what this something might be. I wasn't looking forward to the answer. What I felt was a huge clump of matter stuck to my hair, and just touching it lightly caused some of it to stick to my hand as well. It was a massive ball of fingers and toes. The severed digits were all so sticky and slimy that they'd gotten completely wrapped up in my hair, like rollers. They weren't coming out easily. I must have passed out. When I came to, I was lying on the ground with Sachiko looking over me. She was on the verge of tears again. But wasn't that her voice I heard giggling at me? If not, then whose was it? That had to be it. This sweet little girl couldn't possibly have been that twisted. I didn't care how filthy I was. As long as Sachiko was alright, that was all that mattered. Yes, she was my little sister now, after all. I had to take care of her. I had to look after her. Somehow, Sachiko had wound up in the lead, and I was following her blindly, struggling to keep up with her blistering pace. I looked down at my uniform. Sure enough, it was soaked through with the blood of those poor victims in the body pool and smelled really awful. I didn't recall saying that, or even trying to say that. It's like my mouth was moving on its own, speaking someone else's thoughts. If this was how she was going to treat me, then why was I being so nice to her? Why was I doing whatever she asked of me? It was bothering me, and yet it wasn't. I honestly didn't care anymore. I was content just to follow this abusive little girl to the end of the earth. How long had I been walking, I wondered.
幸子ちゃん、まだ歩くの？
I was following Sachiko despite myself. I had no idea how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. And she'd completely stopped answering any of my questions.
もういいや。
She came to a halt.
どうしたの？幸子ちゃん。
She turned and looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes.
幸子ね、欲しいものがあるの。何？
What was it going to be this time? I honestly didn't want to know, but the question came out of my mouth anyway. And so did this.
幸子ちゃんになら何でもあげるよ。じゃあ次はね。命をちょうだい。命？
Somehow, some part of me knew this was coming. It was only a matter of time.
それはダメし。
Once again, I couldn't seem to control the words coming out of my mouth. It just said whatever it wanted to say, regardless of how I felt.
私の命あげるの？
She was laughing again. It was wild, crazy laughter. She was ecstatic.
ダメどうして？何でもくれるんだよね。お姉ちゃんだもんね。
Sachiko's smile almost seemed to twinkle in the dull light of the corridor. She had the face of an angel, but it was all just a mask.
怖いやだよ。
I mustered all the strength I had, trying with whatever life was left in me to denounce her words and resist her pull. There was no hope for me anymore, but I still clung to what I could. If I could just reject her statement and tell her she was wrong.
ダメ。は？冗談はやめてね。早くお兄ちゃんを探そう。お兄ちゃんならきっと何とかしてくれるからね。ほら、お兄ちゃんを。お兄ちゃん？そうだよ。私はお兄ちゃんみたいになれないけど頑張るから。お兄ちゃんってうるさいんだよ。早くよこせ。殺してやる。殺して首に殺してやる。早く死ねー。幸子ちゃん？
My body shook and spasmed uncontrollably. I was being overtaken by an invisible force. It was compelling me to speak, to say what would be my very last words on this earth. A suicide note, when you get right down to it. It was instantaneous. With one single blow, my skull was cracked wide open and blood splattered far and wide. I could feel blood trickling out from my nostrils and my right ear. My brain was jutting out from inside my head, fully exposed to the air, but I was still conscious. I could still feel everything. I saw a bright flash of light and realized she'd just taken my picture with that instant camera she'd been holding on to. Sachiko was such a cute little girl before, but now her face was twisted into a hateful, spiteful grimace as she looked down on me in contempt.
そうだ、これお兄ちゃんに見せてあげよう。何でもくれるって言ったでしょ。もう私のお兄ちゃん。
Sachiko began petting my sticky, matted head with her coarse, sticky hands in a mockery of my previous gentleness with her. My scrap of paper? From the charm?
お姉ちゃんとはまた遊びたいから、ファクトにはしないであげる。また遊ぼうね、ゆかお姉ちゃん。
Alright, so that was chapter 6. Okay, and the next video will get the wrong endings, so thank you very much for watching. Do please like, subscribe, and fave for more Corpse Party Book of Shadows and other videos.